Good evening, everyone. I would like to welcome you to the Krasno Global Event Series. Thank you for tuning in to our Ambassadors Forum today. Today, we have a special guest, Ambassador Winston Lord. He is here to talk to us about his wide-ranging diplomatic experiences and not least about his involvement in the Nixon administration's opening to China in the 1970s. And he will also talk to us about America's policy toward China in the 1980s and 1990s. I'm Klaus Lares. I'm the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs here at UNC Chapel Hill. The Krasno events have been running for the last 10 years, and we are still going strong. Thank you all for joining us today. Please submit your questions to our speaker today by submitting them in writing via the chat function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Our two Krasno assistants today, Jess and Willow, will select them and read them out aloud to all of us. We are videotaping the event today, and I would like to point out to you our famous YouTube channel on which all the videos of all of our events can be watched again. The address is youtube.com/KrasnoUNC. Today, we are talking about with Nixon and Kissinger in Beijing and the opening to China, a good or bad idea with hindsight? Thus, we will consider the beginning of America's contemporary relations with China in the early 1970s, but also we will look at the subsequent developments until the very present. It is a particular pleasure to welcome Ambassador Winston Lord. Winston Lord is the ideal person to enlighten us about the complicated relationship between the United States and China. Ambassador Lord has been a key figure in US-China relations since the 1970s and also in many other US foreign policy issues. He played a quiet but essential role throughout Kissinger's tenure as Secretary of State. From 1970 to 1973, Winston Lord was Special Assistant to National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger. And in this capacity, he traveled with Kissinger on all his secret and public journeys to China to meet with Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai and also with Deng Xiaoping. He also accompanied Richard Nixon on his historic trip to Beijing in 1972, and he accompanied President Ford on Ford's trip to China 3 years later in 1975. Lord was in every Nixon, Ford, and Kissinger meeting with Mao Zedong, Zhou Enlai, and Deng Xiaoping. In February 1972, when Nixon and Kissinger met with Mao Zedong, Winston Lord was the only other American diplomat in the room. Ambassador Lord also was Kissinger's top advisor on the Vietnam negotiations, and he was in every meeting with the North Vietnamese between 1970 and 1973. Winston Lord also was the principal drafter of the 1972 Shanghai Communique with China, which opened relations with Beijing, and he was the principal drafter of the 1973 Paris Peace Accords, which ended the Vietnam War. He was also involved in the SALT negotiations with the Soviet Union to limit the nuclear arms race, and he was involved in Kissinger's shuttle diplomacy that ended the October War or Yom Kippur War in the Middle East in 1973. After having served as Kissinger's special assistant from 1973 to 1977, Ambassador Lord became director of the important policy planning staff in the State Department. Then he served for over 8 years as president of the Council on Foreign Relations. And in 1985, President Reagan appointed him as ambassador to China. And Winston Lord stayed in Beijing until the early George H.W. Bush administration in 1989. During the Clinton administration, Ambassador Lord was Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, and that was from 1993 to 1997. And once again, he dealt with China and, of course, the many other countries in the region. He also has had many important positions outside government, such as chairman of the National Endowment for Democracy and chairman of the Carnegie Endowment. And he also advises many other organizations, too many to mention here. Winston Lord is married to the best-selling Chinese author and human rights activist Bet Bao Laut. His father was a leading textile industrialist, and his mother, Mary Pillsbury Lord, served for 8 years under President Eisenhower as US delegate to the United Nations and the UN Commission on Human Rights. Ambassador Lord has degrees from Yale and Tufts University and many, many honorary doctoral degrees. In 2019, so quite recently, Winston Lord published a book of interviews with Henry Kissinger entitled Kissinger on Kissinger, Reflections on Diplomacy, Grand Strategy and Leadership. It is a very good read and I can highly recommend it to you. Winston Lord, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to the Krasnov Global Event Series at UNC. Thanks for finding the time to talk to us today.
Well, thank you for the very generous introduction. I couldn't have written it better myself. And I'm happy to be here for both personal reasons and timing reasons. Personally, because my daughter-in-law was an undergraduate at Chapel Hill, University of North Carolina, was a head cheerleader and gymnast. And so I root for them, and I noticed they have a 8-1 record in football, and they're ranked #1 in basketball. So there's much to cheer about. But on timing, to talk about China now is very fortuitous. Important coming, where Xi cemented his authority. And just a few days ago, we had the first face-to-face summit between Xi Jinping and President Biden. So this is a very good time to talk.
Thank you, Winston. It's, as I said, it's greatly appreciated that you found the time to join us today. Let me just ask you straight away, why did the United States and China open relations with each other in the 1970s? First, of course, that opening to China in the early 1970s and then full diplomatic relations in the late 1970s. Why did that not happen in the 1960s? Why in the 1970s?
Well, it didn't happen in the 1960s for several reasons. First, Americans, both leaders and public, thought China was an extreme communist nation, which of course it was. They saw Mao's excesses in terms of repressing its people. It was viewed as a close ally of the Soviet Union. It took a long time for us to realize the tensions and eventual split. So politically, it was very difficult, and no president wanted to take that on. But in the late 60s, Nixon wrote an article in Foreign Affairs magazine, which projected his interest in better relations. His emphasis was to include China in the community of nations and not lead 1/5 of the world's people outside it, angry and isolated, without illusions about the difficulties. Meanwhile, Kissinger, who eventually became his national security advisor, was developing an interest in opening to China, primarily to balance the Soviet Union, because in the late 60s, between the two were clear. So that's the background of how they both came into office with independent views on this, but converging views on the need to open up to China. Now, Nixon chose Kissinger, even though I hardly knew him, because of his background, even though Nixon was a conservative and from the West Coast, and Kissinger was a Jewish immigrant, went to Harvard elite college, which Nixon distrusted, and worked for Nixon's political opponent, Rockefeller, but they converged on China. And the US had several objectives in opening up. We can get into the process as we discussed, but the basic goals of opening to China that Nixon and Kissinger had were the following. First, to establish contact with 1/5 of the world's people. Secondly, thereby hoping to have more stability in Asia generally. Thirdly, and perhaps most important, was to balance off the Soviet Union in the middle of a worldwide struggle during the Cold War. And it was clear that the Chinese were worried about the Soviet pressures as well. Fourthly, to get Chinese help on ending the Vietnam War, which Nixon inherited and had gone on for many years. And he felt that the Chinese, along with the Soviets, might have influence Hanoi to be reasonable in negotiations. And these objectives were more or less met in the coming years. But there were two other broader impacts that I think are just as significant. One, it showed that America was still, by opening up dramatically to China, capable of great strength and maneuverability on the world scene. We weren't bogged down just in Vietnam. We showed that we could act boldly and dramatically in our self-interest and change the international landscape. And secondly, it lifted the morale of the American people. The late 60s was a very difficult period with riots, assassination of our leaders, the Vietnam War, and many other problems. And we were somewhat fatigued and divided as a country. And opening up dramatically to China lifted the morale of the American people. So those are the broad objectives, and they were generally met very successfully.
Yeah, thanks very much. What about the Chinese? Do we know why the Chinese were interested in opening up relations with China? Because China was, of course, still in the middle or towards the end of the Cultural Revolution with all the chaos which accompanied it. So why that sudden interest in opening relations with the United States?
There were two main motivations for the Chinese. First, they were worried about the Soviet pressures. The Russians, the Soviets had occupied Czechoslovakia in 1968, and Brezhnev was declaring that Moscow spoke for all communist countries, which Mao didn't particularly appreciate and was concerned about Soviet pressures. There was a Soviet buildup on the northern border, and then border clashes in 1969, which of course caught the attention of Nixon and Kissinger, and we began the process of getting in touch with the Chinese. So the Chinese first objective was to have the far barbarian America balance off the near barbarian, the Soviets, and through coordinated or parallel policies, balance Soviet pressures and give China a greater sense of security. But secondly, you touched on it yourself, they were very isolated. During the Cultural Revolution, they withdrew all their ambassadors except one in Egypt, and had no contact, really, diplomatic contact with most of the outside world. And so they wished to break out of their isolation, not only by opening up with us, the most important country, but they felt that if we opened up, others would follow in our wake. In fact, we'd held many back, like Japan, cautioning them not to go ahead with the Russians, with the Chinese. And so they felt that this would decrease their isolation, also help them against the Soviets. And just like we achieved our objectives, the Chinese achieved theirs. They did balance the Soviet Union. They got greater security by working with us. And secondly, as in the wake of our opening, many other countries in Europe and Japan speeded up their diplomatic relations, and the Chinese gained admission into the United Nations. So each side achieved its broad objectives. It was a classic win-win situation, as the Chinese like to say.
Thank you. And a personal question, perhaps, what was it like to work with Henry Kissinger? You know, that was still the fairly young Henry Kissinger, who had only just become National Security Advisor, who wasn't the experienced statesman of later years. And you were at a fairly young age as well. So what was it like to deal with the man who, I understand, wasn't always very easy to deal with?
Well, I've always called Henry, as I like to call him, that he is a very close friend, my mentor and my tormentor. Yes, he was very difficult to work with. He stretched my horizons. He made me think more strategically. He pushed me to do the best I could do. But he also stretched my patience and my nerves because he was a perfectionist. No one worked harder than he did. And so it was a real challenge, but exhilarating because the dramatic events and the brilliance of working with him. I'll give you an example of how it was tough to work for him. Among the duties I did for him, both in the White House and the State Department, was to write speeches for him and for the president. And he was very tough on speech writing. He felt speeches were very important, giving signals of our policy around the world and gaining domestic support for a policy. So he never liked the early drafts that I would do, or when I was in the State Department, I'd help with other speechwriters would do. And this is the kind of scenario we usually had in a speech. Now, there's a little exaggeration here, but this captures the flavor of writing speeches for Henry Kissinger and the fact that it was difficult to work for him. Henry would give me a topic to write a speech on. So I'd give him a first draft, and he'd call me into his office a day or two later and say, "Is this the best you can do?" And I would say, "Well, I thought so, Henry, but let me take another crack at it." So I'd go back and rework it. try to make it better and come in with a second draft. And a couple of days later, he said, "Are you really sure this is the best you can do?" And I said, "Henry, I think so, but I'll give it one more try." So anyway, this went on for 4 or 5 or 6 drafts. And I was getting really exasperated. Finally, I went in after my 6th draft and I said, "Henry, I have tweaked every paragraph. I've looked at every semicolon. I've lifted this speech as best I can do. This is certainly the best I can do. I can't improve it any further." He would then look at me and smile and say, "In that case, now I'll read it." So that's not quite right, but it's about the way he did this. Now,
I'd heard that anecdote before, but I didn't realize it was you, that you were the victim.
it was me. Now, let me make a couple other points about him. And he's flawed. Every great man is flawed. I'm not here to pretend he was perfect any more than Nixon was perfect, but they were great men. And I got Kissinger's attention by dissenting from some of his policies. He did not like yes men or yes women. I was on the National Security Council staff in 1969. I wasn't yet his special assistant. And I wrote some memos to him about policy. It was sort of a mini policy planning staff. And in several of them, I would raise questions about policy, not necessarily China, but other issues like Russia or the Middle East, whatever it was. And I often would criticize the policy, or at least suggest improvements or raise questions. Rather than annoying him, it gained his attention. And the main reason he appointed me as his special assistant at the beginning of 1970 was because he liked the qualities of my memo and that I was willing to take him on. He was also very loyal to me, even though he would beat up on me like the rest of the staff in terms of demanding excellence. For example, my first project for him was to do an extensive white paper, a White House paper, on our involvement in Laos. There's been a lot of discussion about how much involvement the previous administrations had, who had been killed in combat. I won't go into details, but as a result of misinformation from the Pentagon and the CIA, I was in charge of gathering all the facts. There was a line in there that said no American had ever been killed in combat in Laos over 20 years. And we put that in the paper. In fact, there had been one incident in 20 years, which really, if we had acknowledged it, would have put everything in perspective. It was so little, but there was about a dozen people killed, but it wasn't even in combat. They were there in a scouting position and they got attacked by the communists and they fought back. But this was discovered, and the headlines in the newspapers were Nixon in white paper lies about Laos history. Which made me quite uncomfortable. It was my first big project for Kissinger. I'd been misled by the other agencies, but I was responsible. And to his eternal credit, he defended me from a very angry White House staff and probably president saying it wasn't my fault. So he had his flaws, but he served this country with great distinction. I'll always be grateful for what he did for me personally.
Thank you. And the opening to China policy, was that agreed by all in the White House, or was it quite controversial? Were there policy clashes also partially perhaps between Nixon and Kissinger, but also by others of their advisors?
Well, no, there was real consensus, and very few people, Nixon, Kissinger, the chief of staff, myself, and a few others, not even the Secretary of State knew the secret contacts we had with the Chinese. We were also taking public steps to signal to the Chinese and to the world and to the American public that we were moving in a different direction. So the language we used toward China, calling them by the People's Republic of China, the Nixon article, certain unilateral steps on trade and travel that we took, which the Chinese didn't have to reciprocate, but would notice, always indicating the direction we had. And there were no real policy disagreements. Certainly, as I said earlier, Nixon and Kissinger had total agreement on this. They had slightly different emphasis. As I said, Nixon was somewhat more concerned about China being part of the world system. Kissinger was somewhat more concerned about China balancing the Soviets. but they both agreed on those objectives and the other ones that I outlined further. Indeed, on February 1st, 1969, 1 week after Nixon inauguration, he sent a secret memo to Kissinger, which said, I want you to get in touch with the Chinese. That's how high a priority he had on this. So there was general support for this within the administration. I think other agencies and certainly everybody in the White House saw the advantages of opening up, even though it was a little tricky politically. People say it was easy for Nixon to go to China, and it was somewhat easier than it would have been, say, from Mondale, who he beat in the election, because, Humphrey in the election, because Nixon being a hardline anti-communist, his right flank was protected. A lot of Republicans who might be uneasy would support him as their president, whereas the Democrats and the liberals generally wanted to do this. So it did make his job easier. But people forget how difficult it was. And as you say, there were 30 years where we didn't move at all.
Thank you. But wasn't it unusual not to involve Secretary of State William Rogers, and as a young foreign policy diplomat, didn't you think it was rather unusual? Didn't you protest to Kissinger, say we need to involve the man?
To say it was unusual is about as understated as saying that North Carolina and Duke have a rivalry in basketball. That's how understated that is. Yes, it was very unusual. It was a secrecy. In the first place, Nixon, who was by far the most able in foreign policy of any president I've worked for, and I worked for many presidents, he was clearly the most strategic and the most well-informed. He wanted to run foreign policy. He wanted to run out of the White House. And that's why he emboldened Kissinger to do it. He was suspicious of the State Department and other bureaucracies, either because they would drag their feet or they're too cautious. And indeed, many State Department advisors on Russia came to Nixon and said, don't open up with China. You hurt our relations with Moscow. But in fact, it improved our relations greatly immediately with Moscow. I did not protest. I saw the sensitivity of it. It was very uncomfortable. And there were and it wasn't just on China. It was on Russia negotiations. It was on the Vietnam negotiations. And Kissinger himself in his memoirs has said that it was a very awkward situation. He thought Rogers, the Secretary of State, handled it with great dignity. And you can argue that it shouldn't have been that close held. But if you look at results, it's tough to argue with the results. And many of these negotiations, like Vietnam and Russia and China, were very sensitive. You couldn't have public displays of what was going on. So I frankly did not object, although I thought it was awkward. And the reasons for secrecy of these negotiations, I think, were justified on balance, but it certainly was an unusual situation. But you have to look at the results, whether they could have been as successful with the wide attention within the bureaucracy and the lack of ability to maintain secrecy under the delicate situation. It's hard to judge.
Mm-hmm. You said before that it was really the Soviet Union and balancing or being the laughing third in that escalating competition in the communist world between the Soviet Union and China, which motivated the United States or the Nixon administration. But how important was trade already, and the vision that China was, at least in the long run, providing a huge export market for American goods? Did that already play a role, or was that a later phenomenon?
It was a later phenomenon. It really had no influence, or it was not an incentive, because then China was extremely poor and isolated. There was no prospects of any real trade between us in the near future. No one could have imagined the extraordinary growth of the Chinese economy in the last several decades. And so this was not a consideration. I mean, there were technical talks during the summit in 1972 while Nixon and Kissinger and I and a couple of others were dealing with the Chinese on Taiwan and the Shanghai Communique and Russia and Japan and other issues, and Vietnam. Secretary of State was in separate negotiations on trade on assets in both countries and on technical matters, but it really was just an attempt to establish a framework for future growth, but it was not a major incentive for either side and didn't become a real factor until at least a decade later.
So it was all geopolitical rather than economic.
It was all geopolitical.
Okay, and tell us about your personal role. You know, were you able to influence and shape things a little bit at all, or were Kissinger and Nixon simply too overwhelming and perhaps too fully convinced of their own views and opinions?
Now, you've hit a very important point. I, of course, deserve all the credit for this opening. Nixon and Kissinger just followed every recommendation that I made, and that I really should go down in history as opening China, and they were just auxiliary. So I'm glad this point came up. No, in a serious moment, there was never any real difference between me. There were some on some other issues that I dealt with, like Vietnam and the Soviets, and to a certain extent the Middle East. But on China, I had no real differences. Now, I can't, after 50 years, it's hard to resurrect every last memo. I want to make very clear, in addition to myself, there was a man named John Holdridge on the staff, an Asian and China expert, who was also heavily involved, although I was fortunate enough to be the one in the Mao meetings and some of the more delicate negotiations. So I was heavily involved in drafting memos, mostly for Kissinger, and sometimes to him in terms of advice, along with Holdridge or by myself. But basically, it would be, we would sit down after a meeting and he would say, here are the points I want to make to the president of this meeting, for example. I would do a draft and he would amend it and do things. So it would be joint efforts. But these were exposing what had happened and relating what had happened rather than debates. And before meetings, I would have suggestions, of course. But it'd be more tactical. It was nothing strategic and never any real differences between us.
Mm-hmm. What about Hal Sonnenfeld? Sonnenfeld was also close advisor to Kissinger's, but he wasn't really involved in the China policy?
No, he was not. But of course, we had an integrated strategy, of course, of how we dealt with the Soviets while we dealt with the Chinese. And Hal was crucial and the number one person, along with another person named Mr. Hyland, on both the Soviets and on Europe more generally, but he was not involved in China.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask you about the secret trip in 1971 in a minute, but just tell me, Kissinger and Nixon's relationship is a mysterious and enigmatic one. We don't really know, we think we know all about it, but then we don't know an awful lot about it. Can you shed some light on this complex?
Sure. Well, first, let me steer your listeners to a couple of sources that I think would be very helpful on this, and I can't do justice in this meeting. One is Kissinger's own memoirs. People are willing to read about 3,000 pages, but a good part of that is their relationship and his portrait of Nixon. Very well-rounded, obviously friendly on the whole, but pointing out the dark side. Secondly, Kissinger's most recent book, Portraits of Leaders, came out a few months ago, and he picks Nixon as one of his 5 subjects, and he gets into his relationship there. It was a complicated relationship for a variety of reasons I'll get into, but it was a very fortuitous one. First, as I alluded earlier, it was extraordinary that Nixon, who had never met Kissinger, maybe one at a social event one time, picked this man who was so different and had worked for his opponent, Rockefeller, and it was part of the liberal Ivy League, Jewish immigrant circles that you didn't think of when you talk about California and Nixon and anti-communism. But he knew how brilliant this man was, and they complemented each other beautifully. First of all, they both looked at foreign policy strategically, not tactically like lawyers, but having a conceptual approach and how the pieces fit together and taking a longer view and putting yourself in the other country's shoes. So they had the general conceptual strategic approach. Secondly, both were extremely well versed in foreign policy. Nixon, by far, of any president, as I said, of course, Kissinger, that was his whole life, along with history. But thirdly, the way they worked together was really ideal. I've seen presidents who micromanage and get into every detail. I've seen presidents who leave everything to their top people, like the Secretary of State or the NSC advisor. Nixon struck a perfect balance, in my view, and Kissinger is the first to point out the credit he deserves and how fortunate he was to work with him, also to be put in charge of foreign policy by him. Nixon would have the grand strategy that he thought should be pursued, which he and Kissinger would talk about and agree upon, toward foreign policy in general and toward specific issues like China. Then Kissinger would be delegated to flesh it out in terms of negotiations and implementation of policy. Nixon would be kept well informed. Nixon would always be given a memo by Kissinger. Sometimes I helped to write these, but what our objectives were in a meeting, say with the Chinese, the Russians, the Vietnamese, and so on. And he would approve the basic approach as well as some of the specific positions. But he wouldn't get into great detail. He had great confidence that he and Kissinger thought alike and that Kissinger would carry out his role. Kissinger, in turn, was a brilliant negotiator and also bureaucratic maneuver and dealing with the press, all of which you needed to carry out foreign policy. And so I think the combination was perfect in terms of how much detail Nixon did or did not get into, and the fact that they approached it in the same way. So that was the plus side. There were some tensions because as Kissinger grew in publicity and reputation in the early 1970s, Nixon was concerned, as was his staff above all, that Kissinger was getting too much credit. Also, that Kissinger was portraying himself on background to the press as sort of the good guy and reining in this tough guy at the top who might be too excessive in his policies and going to liberal parties in Georgetown, Washington. And Nixon was rightly concerned that he wanted to get credit for his policies and not have Kissinger intrude on it. So there always was this tension. A good example is Time magazine, I think it was in 1972 or 3, chose Nixon and Kissinger as co-men of the year. It wasn't persons in those days, it was usually men. Kissinger was horrified. He was obviously, he's got an ego. He didn't mind being chosen that, but he knew that Nixon would be enraged that they would join together. And so he tried to get Time magazine to make Nixon the only person as man of the year. So that was the sensitive side, but it's heavily overridden by the fantastic working relationship, the convergence of strategic visions, the division of labor, and it was a very effective team.
Thank you. Is it true that Nixon actually considered firing Kissinger as national security advisor, but instead he made him Secretary of State in 1973? And that had something to do with Watergate, or how do you see that?
No, Watergate did not intrude on their relationship. It did mean that Kissinger's job as Secretary of State was much more difficult because of our domestic crisis and the countries around the world wondering how effective our presidency and foreign policy could be. But Kissinger was insulated, as was the rest of us on the staff, fortunately, from the whole Watergate and the other darker sides of Nixon's operation. In fact, we were so insulated, we on the NSC staff couldn't even get meals in the White House mess. I would work till midnight and I'd have to order a hamburger to be sent in from the mess. I couldn't go in there and eat. And we didn't even have parking privileges. So we were treated, because I think the Nixon staff was a little suspicious of the staff being sort of liberal and with State Department backgrounds and so on. In any event, we were insulated, so they never intruded. Now, as far as firing, I don't recall ever that there might be rumors of tension, but Nixon knew that Kissinger was too important, that his own historical legacy rested in part on Kissinger's carrying out his policies and doing such a good job. So he might have been annoyed by him, to say the least, at times. I don't want to exaggerate this. There was mutual respect, and they remained friends until the very end, and Kissinger defended him even though he saw the flaws. So I don't think he ever came close to firing Kissinger. He finally decided to let Kissinger not only be Secretary of State, but to hang on to his hat as National Security Advisor. That lasted about a year. It's quite awkward. It's quite amusing because Kissinger, as Secretary of State, would write a memo to Kissinger as NSC advisor, who usually would agree with the Secretary of State. So that was too much power. And so the tension did come up in 1975. Ford kept Kissinger as Secretary of State, but not as National Security Advisor. He appointed General Scowcroft, who had been one of Kissinger's deputies. And there was a moment right after we got back from China where Ford fired the Secretary of Defense, Schlesinger, put in Rumsfeld, and took away the NSC hat. And so Kissinger was close to resigning. I sat down with him in December and January, I forget exactly, 1975, 76, and helped him write about 4 or 5 versions of a resignation letter to Nixon, none of which made any sense. There was no reason for him to resign. He was still Secretary.
That was Ford, not Nixon, I take it.
That was Ford.
Yeah.
Yeah, you asked about Nixon, but my point is that no president asked him to resign, but the fact is he almost resigned.
Mm-hmm.
And so then he finally decided he couldn't figure out a good reason for leaving, and he stayed on. But no, that's a long answer to your question. He was never close to being fired, no matter how annoyed sometimes that Nixon and his top lieutenants like Haldeman would get annoyed at Kissinger's publicity.
Thank you very much. Let's go back to the secret trip to China in 1971, which went via Pakistan or with Pakistan's help. And you, I've heard many times, including from yourself, you were actually the first one into Chinese airspace. Tell us more about it.
Yeah, let me tell you more about the secret trip, which of all the events in my life, probably the most dramatic. The Nixon-Mao summit where I was sat on that meeting, the ending of the Vietnam War after so much agony. Those are the other 2 major events in my early career. But in this case, I claim to be the first one into China. A lot of people think Nixon was first, but most people know Kissinger went on this secret trip in July 71. But I got there before Kissinger. No American official had been in China since 1945 when the communists took over. We were flying in a Pakistani plane from Islamabad to Beijing in July 71. So everybody in the front of the plane was Pakistani, the pilots and the flight attendants. Kissinger and I and some Chinese who came down from Beijing, sent by Zhou Enlai to accompany us, were in the back of the plane. But as the Pakistan
I think we are hanging here.
So 1 millisecond. I've always claimed first American official into China, and Henry's too honest is that I beat him into China. Yes.
Ambassador Lord, you're frozen
Hello?
here, and we couldn't understand the last few sentences you've said.
Yeah, can you hear?
No, right now we have internet problems. I'm not sure what to do about that. Perhaps try to switch on again, and that would help. Could you switch on and off your equipment?
Can you see me now?
I can't see you now, but I can hear you. Can you switch on your camera? Yeah, that's fine. Now your camera is on.
Okay, are we okay now?
Yes, I think it's better now. So you were sitting with Kissinger and some Chinese that Zhou Enlai had sent in the back of the plane.
That's right. And as we got close to the Chinese border, I was in the front of the plane more so than Kissinger, who stayed in the back. And so I was the first into Chinese territory. And Henry, to his credit, has always admitted this in his memoirs. But let me give you some other details about the secret trip, if I can. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Hello?
Yes, I hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. We were going to Asia as part of a public trip to other countries as a cover, as an end in itself. We went to Vietnam, Cambodia, India, and Pakistan. But the whole idea was to sneak off from Pakistan, who had helped set up this meeting secretly. So I was going on this public trip. And before we left, Kissinger said to me, you know, I know you tell your wife everything. My wife is Chinese. She was born in Shanghai. And he said, I know you share secrets. She's very discreet, but this is one event you cannot tell your wife about, that we're going secretly to China, because if it ever leaks out, you and your wife will get blamed because she's Chinese. So you cannot tell her. And I promised Henry that I wouldn't tell my wife. But I also told my wife everything. If I go off on weekends for secret negotiations with the Vietnamese, I wanted to know what's going on. So I had to figure out a way to honor Henry's pledge, but also let my wife know what was going on. So as I was packing the night before we left for this public trip, I went over to the window. Now, in those days, the capital of China was known as Peking, not Beijing. And so I went to the window and I said to my wife, look out here, I think I see a Peking Tom. Now, it's a terrible pun, but she got the point. I said Peking. I didn't say anything more than that. That's all she needed to know. So I could tell Henry I never told her, but she knew exactly where we were going. So anyway, we go on this public trip and we're flying on a fairly cramped plane. Air Force Two was not available, with staff members from the NSC with us, many there for the other parts of the trip, India, Pakistan, and Vietnam, and so on. I was in charge of the briefing books, but we had 3 different versions, to get back to your earlier point about secrecy. We had a briefing book for those of us going into China, and it was just 4 of us, Kissinger and 2 others and myself, plus 2 Secret Service agents. And that gave all the details of what we were going to do in China, our talking points. Then there was another version for a few others who knew we were going to China but weren't going with us. So they didn't have to know the details, but needed enough to know the cover story. Then there was many on the plane who didn't even know we're going to China. And so every time I updated a briefing book for Kissinger, I would have to update 3 briefing books in this small airplane, keeping secret from each section what they shouldn't know. So I'd be exhausted, I'd go to sleep, and Henry would be, having taken a nap, would wake me up and have me do some more changes. He said it was the most extraordinary performance he had ever seen. It was exhilarating, but absolutely nerve-wracking. So anyway, when we're flying toward Beijing, and the cover story in Pakistan, which we had concocted with the Pakistanis, was that Kissinger was going to get sick while he was in Pakistan, go up to a hill house and recuperate for 48 hours. Meanwhile, we'd sneak off to Beijing. The problem is that on the way to Pakistan, Kissinger actually did get a stomach ache, and he couldn't admit it because he didn't want to ruin his cover story later. So anyway, we take off secretly after a banquet in Pakistan, and we're on the airplane. I've already said how I was the first one into China. But the other interesting, amusing fact was that on the airplane, Kissinger, who you would think would be focusing on talks with Zhou Enlai, opening to China, the James Bond secrecy aspect, was really exercised by the fact that he had no shirts to wear in China. His staff assistant forgot to pack any shirts, and he was worried he's going to go around looking like an idiot on this historic occasion. So he borrowed one from Mr. Holdridge, who's about 6'3", Henry's about 5'8", and he put it on. He went around in China looking like a penguin. And furthermore, the label in the shirt said, "Made in Taiwan." So we had a lot of excitement. So we get to China, we're staying in a guest house, and that first night, we were there 48 hours, I went outside and dug up some dirt, Chinese soil, put it in an envelope so I could take it back to my Shanghai wife, who had been born there and so on, born in China. So then we had the talks and we agreed on a summit meeting and the broad agenda for the president's visit and the communique announcing it. But that involves some rather tense negotiations. So we succeeded. I can go into detail, but we have many other subjects. And we flew back to Pakistan, resumed our public trip. And ironically, we went through Paris, had a secret meeting with the North Vietnamese. And we thought we had made a breakthrough, rather naively, we hadn't. But as we flew back to the United States, we thought not only had we opened up to China, which was dramatic enough, but maybe we had made a major step toward ending the Vietnam War. So of all the trips and events I've been involved in, that probably was the most dramatic.
Thank you. Most interesting. What was it like to meet Zhou Enlai and to talk to him and to find out what the Chinese were thinking?
Yes, well, Kissinger has said that Zhou Enlai is the most impressive diplomat he ever met. And I've met fewer than he has, of course, but I would have to agree with that. It doesn't mean he wasn't ruthless. You don't get to be number 2 for Mao or number 3 and make sure you survive and get toward the top of China under communism without being ruthless. But he had extraordinary qualities. He had great strategic vision and took the long view like the Chinese in those days did, which appealed to Kissinger. He liked to approach things that way. And rather than haggling over every detail like the Russians, who sort of like rug merchants, or having intransigence and revolutionary speeches like the Vietnamese, or Talmudic scholars looking over every semicolon like the Israelis, he found the approach Kissinger did with Zhou Enlai much more compatible, which each side would state its basic core interests and then figure out how each side could respect the other side's principles. So Zhou Enlai was very charismatic, very charming, good-looking guy. By the way, he was an actor, as was my father-in-law, my wife's father, and they were in the same play in Tianjin back in the 1930s, I guess. I don't know the exact date. Ibsen's Dollhouse, and my father-in-law and Zhou Enlai were both in the same cast, which is quite ironic to say the least. In any event, Zhou Enlai was a master of his brief. He never had a briefing book, and Nixon, who had these voluminous briefing books, made sure he put them aside so he would not lose face having to rely on his briefing books. By the way, Nixon worked extremely hard for this trip. I was in charge of his briefing books. There were 6 thick books.
We are now talking about the 72 visit, yeah?
That's right.
Yeah.
But that involves Zhou Enlai, of course, as well. But you're right. I'm eliding the 2 when I get to Zhou Enlai. But Nixon read every page, and I could tell, and he would still ask questions as we flew to China. Getting back to Zhou Enlai, he could handle the tactical details. He was very well informed, but he also had the strategic vision, and he was very charismatic. And he was tough, but he tried to meet us part way. And he had very personal elements to him that were quite amazing. For example, when one of our staff was sick on one of our trips, he sent his personal doctor over to take care of that person. Another example was when he and Kissinger in the February 1973 trip, after the final night completing their exchanges, he walked Kissinger back to the state guest house where we were staying, which was very unusual in protocol terms, but he did it for a very specific reason, not only show his respect, but what had happened was the 3 days we were there, Kissinger and I would often walk outside to escape the bugging in our guest house so we could talk frankly. But every time we got to a certain bridge in this compound, a PLA officer would pop up and stop us from going across it. We couldn't understand why. And we would talk about that in the guest house where we were overheard, I'm sure. So when Zhou and I walked Kissinger back to the guest house that final night, he walked Kissinger over that bridge. He didn't say a word, never mentioned what he was doing, but he was basically, he had heard the story and he was showing Henry that he not only respect, but he knew what was going on. So he had these personal touches. Now, one final point on Zhou Enlai, however, his demeanor changed completely in our meetings with Mao. I was in 5 meetings with Mao, Nixon, Kissinger, and Ford. and Joe and I was there. I said he was a great actor. In these meetings, he was not only deferential and quiet in the presence of Mao, he was almost obsequious, versus the domineering, charismatic, in charge Zhou Enlai on our bilateral meetings with him. So it was an extraordinary contrast. And this deference lasted till his death. It's described by by Mao's doctor in his book. Zhou Enlai in 1976 was dying of cancer. Mao was also very sick. So the issue would be the succession. And Zhou Enlai needed an operation for cancer. Mao stopped it, wouldn't let it happen, because Mao wanted to outlive Zhou Enlai and make sure he could put the succession that he wanted. Now, the sad, twisted ending of the story is Zhou Enlai knew that Mao stopped him from getting an operation. I think he would have died anyway, I'm not sure. But despite that fact, as Zhou Enlai lay on his deathbed, he said, "Long live Chairman Mao." So this was a complicated person. And there's debate even to this day among Chinese too, of whether Zhou Enlai was a fantastic figure, relatively humane, reined in excesses of Mao, made the economy and government work where Mao was crazy, protected people and artifacts during the Cultural Revolution, and as a real hero, or whether he enabled Mao and was so deference to him and didn't challenge him really that he enabled Mao to carry out these excesses. I'm of the former view, but there is debate about his place in history.
Mm-hmm. In 1971, on that secret trip, Kissinger did not, and you did not meet with Mao, but a year later, Nixon did meet with Mao. Can you explain to us why that didn't happen in 71 and what it was like to meet with Mao in 72?
Sure. First of all, in 70.
Now you're hanging again.
We were going summit meeting. I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
Now it's improving again. Yes, please.
Yes. In 71, the secret trip was to see whether there would be a summit. Neither side could be sure it would work out after we'd been hostile to each other for 22 years. And so it was kept secret so as not to raise expectations, which might be dashed or have a humiliating defeat. And also so other countries wouldn't be attacking us and making our negotiations more difficult because they were concerned about the outcome. It would have been wildly out of protocol for Mao to meet with Kissinger in any event, given the levels of protocol. And also we weren't sure yet it was going to be successful. Furthermore, Nixon would have been absolutely and correctly outraged that not only did Kissinger get there before him to set up the visit, which he instructed and had to have happen, but that the drama of meeting Mao would be taken by Kissinger first before him. So both sides knew it was inappropriate, it was premature. Of course, when Nixon came, they had to meet, and that was important. Now, I was very fortunate to sit in on a historic meeting. I've always been disappointed. There's an opera called Nixon in China, which is a good opera, by the way. And the climatic scene is the Nixon-Mao meeting. But unfortunately, only Nixon and Kissinger there. I was not there. I was hoping that Jonas Kaufman or Pavarotti or somebody would play my role, but I was cut out of that scene because I was cut out of the meeting and all publicly for many years. It happened this way. Within an hour or two after we arrived in China in 72, Nixon did at the guest house, Zhou and I came over and said, "The chairman wants to see you right away." This is typical emperor style where they summon you on short notice to a meeting, but we were delighted because this meant that Mao would put his stamp of approval on the opening at the very beginning of the visit, whereas normally he would wait to the end for a foreign leader's visit to meet with them. So we were delighted. Nixon asked Kissinger to go with him. And to my eternal gratitude, Kissinger asked me to go because I had been in charge of the briefing books. I'd been on the secret trip. He also wanted a good note taker so he could focus on the meeting and not have to take notes. And so we went to the meeting, but at the end of it, we can talk about the meeting and I'll talk about Mao. At the end of it, Nixon turned to Zhou Enlai and said, Mr. Lord was never at this meeting because he felt correctly that the humiliation of the Secretary of State not being present was bad enough if it was just Nixon and his national security advisor. But to have the third person be a 30-year-old assistant to the national security advisor, be me there instead of the Secretary of State, would have been too much. So when the Chinese came in with the communique with my name and the photo with me in it, these were all altered to keep my presence secret. And so the world, except for my wife and a few others, did not know for years that there were 3 Americans at this meeting, not just 2. The final footnote to this, that on a subsequent trip in February '73, when I went with Kissinger without any president, we were in a meeting with Zhou Enlai very late at night, and Zhou Enlai said the chairman wants to see Dr. Kissinger and Mr. Lord. Now, Chairman Mao wouldn't have known me from Lady Gaga, I don't think. But basically, what the Chinese were doing was very gracious. They knew that the world did not know I'd been at the first Mao meeting. They also knew that Kissinger could only take 1 person to the Mao meeting, and that I was the lowest in protocol. Liaison Office Chief George Bush was there, the National Security Advisor Scowcroft was there, high-ranking State Department official was there. I was low in the totem pole. There's no way that Kissinger could ask me to be the person at his meeting, even though the Chinese knew that he would want me there first of all. So by the chairman specifying my presence, that solved that problem. And I was very grateful. And Zhou Enlai gave me a picture of the Nixon-Mao meeting with me in it, proving that I was in fact there.
Thanks very much. So tell us about the meeting. What was the meeting like, and actually what was achieved, which was perhaps of lasting consequence?
Yes, well, the meeting almost didn't take place. We now hear in retrospect, but even then, Mao was very sick. In the 5 meetings, he kept getting sicker and sicker. And he looked frail in that meeting, but it was apparently a great act of willpower. He was already quite sick, and his doctor wasn't sure he could make it. So for that reason, the meeting only lasted an hour, although the importance of the meeting was it taking place, not the actual length. And at first, Kissinger and I, after the meeting talked, we were sort of disappointed, or at least puzzled, for the following reasons. We were used to the elaborate Mandarin discourse and strategic and tactical exchanges with Zhou Enlai. We hadn't, of course, met Mao, and Nixon was anxious to talk about substantive issues. In the course of the meeting, and this was Mao's style, it's true in all 5 meetings, he would not engage in long substantive exchanges. He would use aphorisms, similes, anecdotes, Chinese proverbs, even bawdy at times, satirical, with irony, and make his points with brushstrokes rather than exposition. For example, he would talk about concerns about the polar bear. Well, the polar bear was the Soviets to his north. He once in a meeting said, I want to send you 10 million Chinese women. Kissinger and I couldn't figure that out. I came back, my wife said he's having trouble with his wife, Madame Mao. And so he's explaining that, and the Gang of Four just came along. In the meeting, however, very important things were achieved. First of all, the fact that it took place put the stamp of approval of this opening and showed the Chinese people and cadres, as well as the world, that he was fully behind and approved this. So the very fact the meeting took place was important. And then the key substantive elements were sketched very briefly by him, but enough to give Zhou Enlai his marching orders and have a framework for our consequent exchanges with him. For example, he said the Taiwan issue could wait 100 years. That's another way of saying, even though this was crucial to them, it's, as we see it here today, 50 years later, it still is. He was basically saying, we'll take care of that over time. History will take care of it, but we got to get on with other issues, like the polar bear, the Soviets. Or he said, Nixon said, you really changed China, and Mao would say, I've only changed a few things outside of Beijing, meaning he knew that he couldn't fully control that society and had to shake it up. He said he liked conservatives, meaning Republicans rather than Democrats. So he made a few sketch points like this, which basically set up the success of the visit, because it meant that the two sides with their great differences would be willing to postpone the insoluble one like Taiwan and others like ideology, and disagree on issues like Vietnam and so on, but get on with the business of, and their original motivations, namely to balance the Soviets and to for the Chinese to come out of isolation, for us to get help on Vietnam and other issues. And so that was the genius of the Shanghai Communique, which, as you said, I helped to write, was to postpone the Taiwan question with ambiguous formulations. We said one China, but to this day, nobody knows quite what it means. And meanwhile, we talked about opposing hegemony, which was a warning signal against the Soviets. And so this was all set up in that first Mao meeting and elaborated by Zhou Enlai and Kissinger and in the Shanghai Communique. Now, one last point about the Shanghai Communique. We had drafted a good part of it in a previous public visit, October 71, in between the secret visit and the February 72 Nixon visit. And we submitted to Zhou Enlai a draft communique, which was sort of typical of diplomatic communiques, pointing out all the areas of agreement and convergence, sort of a feel-good document. It wasn't naive, it talked about differences. Zhou Enlai came back the next day and almost threw it on the floor in contempt. He checked with the chairman, said, "This is ridiculous. We've been fighting each other in Korea. We've been isolated for 22 years, attacking each other. And suddenly we're telling the world that we're good friends. This has no credibility. It will confuse our publics. It will shake up our respective allies. Let's have a document where we set out our respective positions where we don't agree, both in ideology and specific issues. And then in the few areas where we do agree, like hegemony and future contacts, they'll have more credibility and everyone will think we're realistic and not double dealing on this." It was a brilliant move. Took some agonizing readjustment in the last 48 hours by us. So a good part of the communique had been fixed before the Nixon visit. Then we completed the Taiwan portion during that visit. That's a long answer to your question, but Mao meeting basically set up the success of the visit, both by the symbolism and by the substance. And he was a total contrast to Zhou Enlai in style in terms of the way he seemingly and casually went from one subject matter to another with just one or two sentences, but established the framework for the whole visit.
Thank you. Was there ever any concern among Nixon and Kissinger and yourself that Mao, of course, had caused the deaths of millions of people with the famine in China? He had unleashed the Cultural Revolution, which had led to a lot of dead and displaced persons, to a lot of chaos, that negotiating with such a man was perhaps not the right thing to do. And also perhaps you couldn't rely on the results, that perhaps Nixon would be embarrassed in a major war if China did not stick to what was agreed at these meetings and in the Shanghai Communique.
These are fair questions. On the second one first, no, we felt that the Chinese would suffer if they broke their word and we broke off, because they had their incentives that I've outlined, and their isolation would have been deepened. They wouldn't achieve the balance against the Soviets. And so we felt it was self-enforcing in their own self-interest. And that's the way Nixon and Kissinger approached the Chinese, by the way. They would talk in terms of China's self-interest and why they could do some things in parallel or in agreement with us, which would serve their interests, rather than exhorting them and so on. On the first question, very frankly, we're in the Cold War with the Soviets. And not only with China, but with many other countries, human rights was not a major issue. It was put aside because we had to get on making sure we didn't have a nuclear war. And it meant for some awkward alliances, to say the least. And we knew of the excesses of the Cultural Revolution, and it was still going on, but we didn't know the full extent of it. And we knew Mao was ruthless, of course, and they were communists after all. So there was certain distaste, of course, for their system. But the overriding perception then is that we had to get on with the geopolitical dimensions that I've sketched, and that we would hit a brick wall if we talked about human rights anyway. So very frankly, in the opening, human rights was not a factor. It became one, of course, later in our relationship. But this was not only true with China, it was true with a lot of unsavory governments that we worked with, because balancing the Soviets and preventing a nuclear war had to take prime consideration.
And when actually meeting with Mao, that knowledge about his excesses was kind of pushed aside by his domineering personality, by the importance of the day, or how was that personal perception?
Well, he was tough, but he was also jovial. And of course, we didn't raise the issue, to be honest. So he didn't have to take any position on it. And if we had, he would have pushed back very strongly. He says, none of your business.
No, what I meant is, but you were aware of the excesses without
Oh,
even.
of course.
Yeah.
Well, we were. I would say, of course, we were aware of the ruthlessness. I mean, in the 1950s, the Great Leap Forward, the anti-rightist campaign, and then the Cultural Revolution, and just communist system in general. In fact, for a long time, you asked one of your first questions why we didn't normalize earlier with China. Well, in the 50s and early 60s, the perception in America that Mao and the Chinese were even more extreme than the Soviets. Mao used to talk cavalierly about nuclear weapons, and it basically said, there's a nuclear war, you might knock off a couple 100 million Chinese, but we got several 100 million more, you know. So that was the perception, and it made the opening much more difficult earlier on. So yes, we were aware of the excesses. We didn't like them, but we also knew that we had a higher goal, at least in the short term, to do the kind of things I said we set out to do, the various objectives, and that it would be fruitless to raise it anyway and could have spoiled the opening. These are tough choices in diplomacy, where you have to balance off your values and human rights with geopolitical, economic, and security concerns. And it means for some compromises. And I do feel I'm strong on human rights. My mother took Eleanor Roosevelt's place, as you said, your introduction, ambassador to the Human Rights Commission. My wife is a human rights activist, has gotten a personal award from Clinton in the White House for her efforts, chairman of Freedom House and many other issues. So I was chairman of the National Endowment for Democracy. So I've always felt strongly about human rights, but I also did not object at the time to subsuming it for these other broader issues.
Thank you. When you compare Nixon's trip in 1972 with the trip by Gerald Ford 3 years later in 1975, what had changed or what had developed? What was the difference between the trips?
A total difference. The Ford trip, although we obviously both sides tried to say it was a success, got us nowhere. Now what had happened is the following. First, Nixon, I think, intended to try to have diplomatic relations with China in his second term, but of course he was removed because of Watergate. Ford had to look over his shoulder at Ronald Reagan, because Ford was, he moved up to the presidency, but Reagan challenged him in the primaries. And Ford had to be careful about his getting nominated again by the Republican Party. People forget that Reagan came pretty close, and Reagan was fiercely against the China opening and was very pro-Taiwan. And so anything Ford did that was controversial on Taiwan was going to get him in political trouble. So he didn't want to unravel the China initiative, but he couldn't do anything on Taiwan and couldn't really move ahead greatly with the Chinese. The Chinese, in turn, had their own succession issue. And by this time, Deng Xiaoping was in charge, and he was going to be struggling with a gang of 4 radicals who was going to take Mao and Zhou's place. He couldn't afford to look soft on Taiwan, which was the key issue between us either. So neither side could move forward in this. Furthermore, because of Watergate and congressional reassertion on foreign policy, despite Kissinger's heroic efforts, and he was successful to keep our foreign policy alive, including the China initiative, we just couldn't make dramatic steps. So the Ford visit was more of a holding action. It didn't set things back, but we couldn't move forward. And indeed, in setting up that trip, we went in, I believe, October 75, 2 months before the December trip. And the original idea when we went there was to spend several days in China, including outside of Beijing, have visit several cities, and have the trip China only. The trip went sufficient. In that October trip, though, to set it up, we got stiff-armed by the Chinese, partly for the reasons I mentioned. Deng had to show he was a tough guy at this point because of the succession. So there was no prospects of real success. And we were sufficiently annoyed by the Chinese hardline, we wanted to send them a signal. So when we got back to the United States, we did two things. First, we cut the proposed trip of several days down to about 2 or 3, only in Beijing, and we're not going to have Ford visit anywhere else. And secondly, we added Indonesia and Philippines to the itinerary, so it wasn't just a China trip. So we were indicating in advance we were not happy with the way they were proceeding. It went off well enough. It was not a disaster, and Deng, to his credit, tried to tell the press it was quite successful. So, but in fact, it was a total contrast to the success of the Nixon trip. I have to give you one story on Ford and Mao, if I could.
Sure, go ahead.
President Ford was a very decent man. He served his country beautifully. He brought us together after Watergate. He lost chance for re-election by pardoning Nixon very courageously. Whether you agree with it or not, it took great courage. But he wasn't always the most brilliant person, in my opinion. And this was shown in his meeting with Mao. Mao, by this time, is extremely sick, very frail. So when Ford walks in, Mao says to him, "I will soon receive an invitation from God." Of course, indicating he's about to pass away. Ford looks a little puzzled. Anyway, we sit down for the meeting. It goes on about an hour and a half. And then Ford, as he's leaving, goes up to the chairman, shakes his hand and says, "I want you to know, Mr. Chairman, I hope you get that invitation from God very soon." Fortunately, of course, the interpreter said, "Mr. Chairman, President Ford wishes you 1,000 years of happiness," or something, you know. So he didn't quite understand what was going on. But Kissinger and I almost fainted when he said that, but we were rescued by the interpreter. On the other hand, Joe and I, I'm sure, understood what he had said. So that was quite amusing. But I don't want to put down the president. He was a very decent, and he did a lot of service to his country. But this was a rather amusing / frightening episode.
Absolutely. Thank you for letting us know. While the China negotiations and the opening and the rapprochement with China went on, there were also the SALT negotiations taking place, the Vietnam negotiations taking place, and also in 1973, the Yom Kippur War, October War, and Kissinger's shuttle diplomacy. How was that all possible, that all these major events were taking place simultaneously, and you were involved in all of them?
I was very fortunate to be in all four. And just to punctuate the year, and I'll get back to your question, but 1972 was an extraordinary year. And it all hinged, I think, on the secret trip in July 71. When we went in July 71, we set up the presidential visit. And within days of announcing that visit, a whole chain of events started taking place over the coming months. We immediately got the Soviets' attention because they saw we're opening up to their neighbor, and it made them nervous. They had dragged their feet on a summit meeting, and they suddenly agreed to a summit meeting after dragging their feet for a year or two. We made breakthroughs in SALT, the arms control negotiations on Berlin, and we had a dramatic summit meeting. We also then made breakthroughs with Vietnam, partly because of the opening to their two patrons, giving them aid, making them a little nervous, even though they didn't. They both helped to encourage Vietnam to negotiate, North Vietnam, so they could get this irritant between us out of the way. So we made major progress in Vietnam. So what you had was in 72, to get to your point, we had the president's visit in February 72. We had the Moscow summit with Berlin and Salt and all the other accomplishments in May 72. In October 72, we made a breakthrough with the Vietnamese on peace negotiations, which were then signed in January 73. And meanwhile, we were about to launch the first of the shuttle diplomacy with the Middle East. So obviously I'm biased in terms of the accomplishment of the Nixon-Kissinger era, but if you look at the landscape when they came in and what was accomplished by 1973, as you point out, it was quite extraordinary, and it all fit together. Our opening to China propelled the Soviets to a more accommodating position. Our opening to both communist giants put pressure on the Vietnamese to negotiate. Our credibility on the world scene having been restored and American support gained gave us greater leverage as we moved into the Middle East and tried to reduce Soviet influence there. So it all fit together and it was part of their strategic vision. When Nixon came into office in '69, we had no contact with 1/5 of the world's people. We had a very tense relationship with the Soviets, which was then stabilized, not normally dangerous, and handed on to next succeeding administrations. We had a Vietnam War raging on, and we ended that, and we had no real influence vis-a-vis the Soviets in most of the Middle East, and we managed to move in that area. So to take the landscape, both the foreign policy paralysis in the Vietnam War, the domestic unrest and assassinations and the cynicism, and to transform that landscape in 2 or 3 years is really quite an extraordinary achievement. You asked how was it done? It was because of the strategic fitting of the pieces together, and frankly, the brilliance of Nixon and Kissinger.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We need to rapidly move on because we have plenty of questions from our audience as well. But let me ask you about the 1980s. You became ambassador to China in 1985 and stayed until 1989, the early year of the George H.W. Bush administration. That was over 10 years after the first opening to China by Nixon and Kissinger. What was your impression? What had changed? How did you feel yourself by being suddenly back? You know, so you were now an established ambassador rather than a young aide to Henry Kissinger. Tell us about the difference.
Well, first of all, I might point out that I think one of the listeners tonight was my deputy in China, man, and Peter Thompson, who was fantastic, helped me there and in the State Department in a later assignment. So if he were here, he could also give you some views. But I was very fortunate in my timing going to China. And I've always been grateful for President Reagan appointing me. By the way, I am bipartisan. I was appointed by Clinton as well as Reagan and Nixon and so on. And one reason Reagan appointed me because his wife, Nancy Reagan, had read my wife's novel, Spring Moon, a bestseller. And she was so enthralled by it, she told Reagan, you ought to appoint Lord as ambassador, you get 2 ambassadors at the price of 1, which was true, because she was an extraordinary partner in that effort. And we were very fortunate of the timing. Taiwan always hung over the relationship, but it was still an issue. But there's a third communique between us and the Chinese, which eased that issue in the early 80s. And the relationship was beginning to be more stabilized. And furthermore, the Chinese were relatively open in their discussions. It was still a communist repressed society, but you had leaders like Zhao Ziyang and Hu Yaobang and others who were discussing political reforms. So we were there. By the time I got there in '85, the tensions of Taiwan had been reduced and the relationship was more stable. And there was also more political openness in China, again, all relative. So while we were there, we would have dissidents, reformists, and government and party officials sitting around the dining room table in our embassy residence talking about political reform. My wife produced the play Caine Mutiny with the all-Chinese cast, brought Charlton Heston over from America to direct the cast. And that was rather subversive because it's about a crazy guy in charge of a ship. You think of, wow, a crazy guy in charge of China. And the contacts my embassy had, and all our officers, as well as my wife with reformers and so on, was really quite extraordinary. I'm not exaggerated. They weren't suddenly becoming a democracy, but it was by far the best time in US-China relations in the last 50 years, and by far the most open China. It's one reason people got optimistic that China might go in the right direction, become more open, which is dashed by Tiananmen Square. But we left just before the Tiananmen Square massacre. 1 week after Hu Yaobang's funeral, and 1 week after his death, the day of his funeral, it was the first demonstrations in Tiananmen, and we left just as this was happening. And of course, after that, relations were very difficult. So they're doing an open period. So I was there. Obviously, it was the highlight of my career because I could work with my wife, who was Chinese and did so much. And because we were hopeful both in the relationship with China and relative direction they were going. We weren't naive. They were still communists, and they weren't going to become a Jeffersonian democracy overnight. So it was an exciting time and a hopeful time. And of course, all of us were dashed and terribly disappointed and angry about the Tiananmen Square massacre.
In the middle of 1988, you spoke to the Democracy Salon at Tsinghua University. And that was, of course, the high point, or leading up to the high point of student unrest and student requests for more freedom and democracy. Did you believe that movement would lead to a successful end, or did you already fear that the government would clamp down on these efforts?
Well, you mentioned 1988. It was actually at Beijing University, Beida.
Beida, not Tsinghua.
It became known later as the. Yeah, that's a detail. It doesn't matter. But the Chinese and many who became dissidents during Tiananmen Square held a series of outdoor gatherings with visiting speakers, and they invited myself and my wife to come. Now, we were a little naive. We knew there was some concerns among students about free expression, certainly student living conditions, and the populace in general about inflation and corruption. And so we were noting that, but in '88, no one knew what was going to happen a year later. So when we went out there, we didn't think this was all that sensitive for us to meet with the students. We made it a major effort, all my officers did, and I and my wife, to get to universities and think tanks and meet as many Chinese people, including the young people, as possible. So we went out there, but I was careful because I knew there would be agents of the party in the crowd, hundreds of Chinese students. We went on for hours. Most of the questions were not sensitive. They're about our marriage or what it's like in America, of China. Not to get sensitive topics would be critical of the regime. And I even praised Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms and opening to the outside. And in fact, that was highlighted in a Hong Kong headline the next day about Lord supports Deng reforms. What was interesting, though, I could tell from the questions about the simmering unrest. They were careful, but you could see the restlessness. And so I was very careful. What happened was a clear signal that something was going to happen in the next year or so. It's an extraordinary event. I was at a banquet about 3 days after we went to Democracy Salon. The then Chinese ambassador to the US, a man named Han Shu, was on home leave. He came up to me at the banquet and said he had a personal note from Deng Xiaoping to me personally. It was polite but firm. Basically, it said, you cannot and should not meet with Chinese students without my permission. This is an extraordinary rebuke from the leader to the American ambassador. I replied, obviously diplomatically, but I basically said, get lost. I'm going to meet with students. Your ambassador can meet with our students. I've been meeting with the young people. I want to know the young people. I've been respectful of you and your party. And therefore, I basically said, I'm going to continue. I don't feel I have to check with you. Now, this is all, it was verbal and I was polite, but that was my message. For the next 2 weeks, lo and behold, various appointments I had at universities and think tanks were canceled. They finally got over it after a couple of weeks and we resumed, but it showed you how fragile already and how nervous Deng and the others were about what was coming. But to answer your question further, we knew there was unrest, but nobody could have predicted Tiananmen. People forget now what happened in Tiananmen. The average American, if he remembers it all, and the Chinese don't know it all because the Chinese have buried that in their history and no young people in China even know what happened. It was not just students in Beijing. First of all, the people from all walks of life, including party members, journalists, military types, peasants, workers, media types, you name it, they were marching. There were over 1 million people, many days, never a single act of violence or unrest. And this took place, not on that scale, but it took place in something like 250 Chinese cities. And in those days, you didn't have social media spreading the word. You had bullhorns and a few fax machines. So it was an extraordinary outpouring, not just on democracy, it was on inflation and corruption and so on, other issues. So it was nobody could have predicted this. In fact, even though it was crushed, it gave many of us hope that this feeling was so widespread that maybe China would be forced to move in a more positive direction. So that was 88 really previewed 89, but we couldn't be that clear about how momentous that movement would become. Now, once it did happen, we were surprised in a way the Chinese didn't crack down even earlier. They let it be televised, and when my wife was over there as CBS correspondent on television covering it, because we had already left China, I'd left several months before, and everyone was puzzled why they let this go on as long as possible, even when Gorbachev from the Soviet Union came to visit. But then they finally did crack down. They didn't have to, but the time they massacred people, it was already dying out. But Deng wanted to make a point. In addition to kicking out Zhao Ziyang, his liberal prime minister, he also wanted to make the point that don't try this again. This is what will happen.
But for you, it came as a surprise. You had not expected that the government would send in the tanks?
No, well, let me be very clear here. What was a surprise, not only to me, but I think almost everybody in the world, was the scale of the peaceful demonstrations a year later. So it was not a total surprise that there was unrest, but that this would break out all over China and go on for so long. That was a surprise. Once it started, I think I certainly and others feared that they would crack down at some point. Yeah, absolutely. I, in fact, was surprised in a way they had to move sooner. Mm-hmm. So I was shocked and I was mad because it was unnecessary, but I was not surprised.
Mm-hmm. But in 1988, you said you also believed that perhaps China would be developing into a more democratic direction. And I understand that was also what the Clinton administration in the 1990s largely believed. At that time, you were Assistant Secretary of State between 1993 and 1997, I believe. Was that your view as well, that democracy in China was quite a possibility after Tiananmen?
Well, let's be precise on this. None of us believed that China was going to become like an American democracy in the foreseeable future. But most Americans, experts as well as the public, certainly before Tiananmen, felt that China would have to move and would move at some point. For example, and this was not naive. People didn't think it would happen immediately, and they weren't naive about communism. But the fact is, in Taiwan, which after all has got Chinese flavor to it, South Korea, Indonesia, Chile, the Philippines, once a middle class was built up and the economy was sufficiently strong, there was movement toward political reform, and people said, man or woman does not live by bread alone. So there's no reason to think that history would not repeat itself at some point, that once they got to a certain level of prosperity, that these factors would kick in. Secondly, in an increasingly globalized economy, you need to be open to the world for ideas and innovation and technology and trade. And all the students coming here and other Chinese citizens and all the Americans going there, there was a feeling in their own self-interest to develop the economy and through the pressures of aspirations for political liberalization that they might move in or could move in this direction. That was one reason. Successive administrations of both parties supported engagement and opening up to try to keep these forces at work without being naive about it. It's now convenient to say this was naive. No one expected instant democracy, but we did feel we were helping to move a process that history told us would be repeated. Now, of course, particularly since about 2008, and especially under Xi Jinping with repression at home and adventure abroad and interfering in other societies, our policy has to change, should change, and has changed.
So with hindsight, when you look back both to the opening to China, but also to giving a most favored nation status to China, and also involving them, including them in the WTO in 2001 in order to facilitate trade relations in the last resort, was that the right policy at the time, or with hindsight, was the Western world mistaken?
No, it was the correct policy. We're getting a lot of issues that we can't do justice to, but first of all, what was the alternative? Containment? Containment would never have worked because other countries would not join us, and single-minded containment would just isolate us and cause tensions with other countries. Plus, China began its sheer size and its semi-market approach for a while on the economy and the entrepreneur and skill of the Chinese people. They were going to rise anyway. So containment was not a realistic alternative. Secondly, if we hadn't opened up, the following would not have happened, certainly right away, and may never have happened. Number one, well, it probably would have happened at some point. We would have been isolated still from 1/5 of the world's people. We would not have made the progress immediate with the Soviet Union that we did. We would have had more difficulty in the Vietnam War. We would have had less credibility on the world stage, including on the Middle East. And so we had these immediate benefits. The Chinese had their benefits too, which would not have happened if we hadn't opened up. And then I've explained that since then, under several presidents of both parties, the feeling was, even after Tiananmen, after a while, the feeling was we could still try to steer the Chinese in the right direction by the opening, just by virtue of their self-interest. But no one ever thought this was going to lead to instant democracy. And it's revisionist to say that was our main goal, to change China's regime. No one ever thought that could happen, certainly by us. That has to be done by the Chinese people. But we did feel the policy engagement could nurture that process until, as I say, China really began turning in a much harsher direction, particularly under Xi.
So the hope change through trade was quite justified at the time, but
Well, that was the feeling. The WTO you mentioned, that was under administration I wasn't serving in, but I supported it, feeling it would force them to reform their economy. And in those days, they had a man named Zhu Rongji in charge of their economy, and so on, that indicated they wanted to open up that economy more, which would be in our self-interest in terms of American exports and jobs and investment. And again, by opening China economically, the hope was it might open them a little bit politically, again, without being naive. But if the Chinese observed all the WTO agreements and we extracted some good concessions on paper, these benefits would have flown for that. They violated a good many of them. Mm-hmm. And so we have been disappointed there as well.
But when you look at the current tension and the strain in the relationship, which is of course not healthy for neither side, something must have gone wrong. What went wrong? And I'm sure it couldn't have been just the Chinese. It must also have been the American side which made mistakes, which steered the relationship into the, well, not the most healthy direction in the end.
Well, I'm not here to say that we've been perfect or that we haven't done certain things that are provocative to the Chinese. For example, we fly a lot of reconnaissance flights very near their territory. I'm sure we get some intelligence from it, but we complain about their air flights around Taiwan. We do things that I'm sure they don't like. But very frankly, even though you can nitpick some American actions, and under Trump, although I agreed with some of his China policies, get hysterical and anti-Chinese and so on, we've exacerbated the problem. The overwhelming responsibility for the downturn in relations is the Chinese fault, in my opinion. And I try to be objective. It doesn't mean I don't want good relations. I'm relatively pleased with the meeting earlier this week to stabilize the relationship. And I hope we can. We certainly have to avoid war. But particularly starting in 2008, with the financial crisis, where China thought they did well and the West fell on its face, and therefore they didn't have to take any lessons, and they had the Olympics, and they began to feel muscular and had a right to have a greater role on the world stage, given their greater diplomatic and other and economic strength. But they began to pressure in certain areas like the South China Sea and so on. However, this was manageable until Xi, and I think the major responsibility for the deterioration relations is the incredible crackdown at home of all expressions of freedom and a surveillance state. You locking up not only dissidents, but lawyers who defend dissidents. What he's doing in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs, the destruction of Hong Kong's identity, the provocative pressures on Taiwan, the militarization and expansion of influence in the South China Sea and the East China Sea with Japan, his conflict with India on the border, his interference in other societies, whether it's cyber interference or election interference. All these things have exacerbated the relationship versus an America that for many administrations welcomed China's rise, helped to nurture it with trade and investment, never tried to contain it. And so I think the responsibility lies heavily with the Chinese and specifically with Xi.
Thank you. And what now can be done to save the relationship, to make sure that war and military conflict will not break out sometime in the future?
Right. Well, a good step was taken this week, the most you could expect.
You're referring to the Biden-Xi
I'm
meeting.
talking about the Biden-Xi meeting 2 days ago. There was no compromise. No one could expect to compromise on the tough issues between us. There was a recognition that we would be competing fiercely. But it did accomplish several things that most you could do in the short term. It did lower the temperature between us, which is getting quite dangerous. It gave a chance for the two leaders for the first time to meet personally. They had 5 telephone calls, and Xi and Biden knew each other very well from many years ago, long meetings together. So getting together and outlining to each, and Biden kept pointing this out, each side's red lines, core interests, what had to be observed. It reduces the chance of miscalculation and accident getting us into a conflict. Although I'm not sure whether military to military talks and hotlines and rules of the road were discussed. I haven't seen proof of that. That's important to get those resumed so we don't stumble into war. Neither side wants a war, could afford it, and will do everything to avoid it because it should be destructive and self-interest. So frank talk like that, establishing basic red lines is useful. Furthermore, they agreed to resume exchanges, which the Chinese cut off after Pelosi's visit. And so particularly on climate agenda, where the two of us are so crucial for that, they've agreed to restart those talks. Also on issues like food and trade and other issues like that will be resumed. So that's positive. The Secretary of State, Blinken, will go to China early next year. And so I think we're managed to stabilize relationship, perhaps open some avenues of limited cooperation on shared goals like climate change. I like to see that on the pandemic goal. I didn't see any report on that. So that's what has to be done. No illusions that we're going to suddenly become convergent or have a lot of agreements. Certain global issues like non-proliferation, climate, pandemic, food security, debts for some of these countries, we should be able to manage the global economy. We should be able to work on, but meanwhile, we're going to compete fiercely. And what you do is compete within certain ground rules that are fair, we hope, and enforce those, manage the problems you can't solve, and work in the limited areas where we can agree. And I think the Biden administration trifecta of invest, align, and compete makes sense. Invest meaning competing with China starts at home and building up and restoring our democracy and its ability to invest in our future to be competitive. Align meaning work with other countries, allies, and friends for greater leverage with China, whether it's on trade or human rights or anything else. And then compete within that framework. This, I think, is the right approach. And I think on the whole, the Biden administration is taking the right approach. Also, there was the American readout on Ukraine, which is important, was that the Chinese agreed with us that nuclear weapons shouldn't be used. I note that the Chinese didn't include that in their readout, but that was useful to make that point. And Biden reassured the Chinese that our one China policy, however ambiguous, has not changed. Now, having said all that, the jury is out. Is this just a hopeful blip where the temperature is lowered and temporarily things look a little bit less stark? And the Blinken visit and other exchanges begin to stabilize the relationship? Or is it just an interlude and it'll be overtaken by events? And I keep our eye on the Taiwan issue, which of course is the most sensitive for the Chinese. In the Congress, in both parties, there's a very strong movement to greatly increase our ties to Taiwan. I'm in favor of doing that unofficially, keeping our one China policy. But they would expand our arms sales, not only in quantity and quality, to provide Taiwan self-defense so they don't have to worry like the Ukrainians did with the Russians, but also help pay for it, and other steps to make it a more official relationship. I'm a believer in deterring the Chinese and building up Taiwan's autonomy and self-defense, but some of these steps would be extremely provocative, and if they're taken, Xi will probably have to react, and what we've seen this week could become unraveled.
Thank you. But you don't believe in decoupling and the spheres of influence world, do you?
No, I believe in continuing as many exchanges as possible. I think some decoupling, it's impossible across the board and not in anybody's interest, including our own self-interest, in terms of the intertwining of our economies. That's what's different from the Cold War. We had no economic action with the Soviets. So that's not going to happen. However, there are some legitimate security concerns, and I would consider, include in that, export of chips, microchips that we recently did, a huge step, by the way. But what we ought to do is pick a few areas of genuine security concerns and build high walls and restrictions on them, but not spill over to other areas that are less threatening. We ought to maintain as much trade as we can, consistent with our security interests. And we ought to maintain Chinese students and scientists and other exchanges taking place as much as possible.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Winston Lord. Thank you very much for your insights and interesting illumination of the opening to China and your personal experiences and involvement in that. We have plenty of questions waiting for us. And if I may ask you to stay with us for a little while, then I would like to ask Willow to ask the first question, please.
Okay.
Certainly. Thank you so much for joining us today. We have a lot of very interesting questions from the audience members. So we're going to start with something a little bit more modern. Someone asks, in recent years, with the rapid growth and global dominance of China, some folks have been feeling some degree of regret over opening up to China. Do you feel as though China would have achieved this level of global competitiveness if the US had not been so involved in opening up the Chinese economy?
Well, we partially addressed that question earlier. I think it's fair to say if the US had no trade or investment or technology openness to China, along with other countries like Japan and Western Europe, of course, China wouldn't have grown so fast. There's no question about that. I think, though, as I said earlier, they were going to grow in any event, it would have been dangerous to try to contain them and ineffective because we wouldn't be joined. And so even though now we are concerned about China's competitiveness, I think for all the reasons I won't go over it, that it was not a mistake to open up. We didn't have an alternative. Now we have to get firmer now and be more careful about trade and investment. But I think the main point we ought to keep in mind in dealing with China, we ought to be self-confident about this competition. First of all, China does deserve greater seats at the table and more influence in world affairs, as long as they respect international law and norms and stop interfering in other countries' societies. So, secondly, we're not a hegemonic or imperialist nation, and it's not our nature nor in our interest to try to keep them down, nor would have been possible. And above all, we ought to feel we can be self-confident. I want to get time to other questions, but very quickly, this should be a Sputnik moment for us. We ought to greet the Chinese challenge as a way to wake us up. You remember back in the 60s, the Russians launched satellites ahead of us and cosmonauts, and Kennedy and then succeeding administration said, we got to invest in our own competitive industries and so on. And it woke us up and helped us. We ought to treat the China challenge the same way. If, and it's a big if, we can get our act together in terms of the polarization in this country, getting our democracy on a healthy state, and we can get some investments to compete in the future. There's no reason why we can't use this as an opportunity as well as a challenge. And we've got so many assets compared to the Chinese, our immigration and therefore our birth rate compared to their demographic challenge. We have 40 or 50 allies. They've got North Korea, essentially, our better universities, our entrepreneurial and innovative business community, and this system that we have. There's just one asset, the fact that we have two oceans, Mexico and Canada as neighbors. The Chinese are surrounded by 14 countries with whom they've had border disputes. There are terrorists and Muslim extremists, and nuclear weapons are all around them. There's no reason we can't compete. They've got debt problems, they've got environmental problems, they've got population problems. They cannot compete with us if we do our act correct, and we shouldn't try to keep them down. We ought to welcome the competition.
Thank you very much. Jess, would you go to the next question, please?
Absolutely. This question is from Stuart Rosler. And he says, given China's current policy and President Jinping's unprecedented third term, do you think it is likely that China and the US reach an agreement on the political status of Taiwan?
The answer is no. Certainly not in the future. It's not up to us to reach agreement. That's up to the Taiwan people and the Chinese. So our position, and it's been very consistent through 9 administrations, is the fact that the future of Taiwan has to be resolved peacefully between Taiwan and China, with the assent of the Taiwan people. It's hard to know what the Chinese people want, given their system, but that we would accept any outcome as long as it's arrived peacefully and with these principles respected. So that could include 2 Chinas, which I can't imagine China ever agreeing to. Independence, hard to envisage coming from the Chinese side, or anything in between. But that's going to be determined by China, 2 sides of the straits, not by us. And so we have to manage this problem, respect the one China principle, and again, it's vague, but it's workable. Not be overly provocative, but help build up deterrence against a Chinese attack, help strengthen Taiwan unofficially, and hope the 2 sides eventually can work it out peacefully. By the way, in the next 10 to 15 years or so, I would say there's 0 of these invasions. There is a danger, however, of accidents or miscalculations, particularly given Chinese provocations in air and sea space around Taiwan. And there's a danger that they could choke Taiwan economically economically more with boycotts of what to do on the offshore island as far ahead as I can see. And not everyone agrees with me on that, but that's my view.
Thank you, Ambassador Lord. Unfortunately, the quality of the internet is hanging again, but let's go to the next question by Willow. But it was good to hear that you're not expecting that an imminent invasion of Taiwan is just round the corner. Willow, would you like to ask the next question?
Well, was some of my answer not heard or what? Is that what you're saying?
No. Let me ask Willow for the next question.
Yeah.
We go to the next question. Yeah.
Yeah. This is going to be a question about the actual opening up or China's decision to actually open up to the US. How much, if at all, did the strong trade relations between Japan and the US during the 60s and 70s impact China's decision to open up?
As I understand, the question is whether China was compelled to open up by the trade between US and Japan.
Yes.
Yes.
No, that wasn't a factor. No, the Chinese had two major factors on their side. One was get out of their isolation and with more diplomatic relations, get into UN, and the other to balance the Soviet threat. So trade and these other issues, crucial as it is today to China, was not at all a factor then. Now, Japan, they were always concerned about. We made the point, can you still hear me all right?
Yes, it has improved again.
Kissinger and Nixon made the point to the Chinese that they should welcome our alliance with Japan because this meant Japan didn't feel it had to militarize. The Chinese had a horrible experience, of course, with Japan in World War II, and they're always worried about Japan becoming a military power again. We said that Japan felt secure under a nuclear umbrella and China should welcome our ties. At first, Joe and I disagreed. He was against all alliances, but it showed you how diplomatic exchanges can have an impact. And over time, the Chinese began to accept that view and they felt that our relations with Japan should be good. Indeed, one meeting that Kissinger had with Mao, he scolded Kissinger for not paying enough attention to Tokyo. And in fact, Kissinger then, not because of that, he's going to do it anyway, visited Japan about 8 or 9 times to mend the tensions that had arisen with the opening. Because when we opened to China, we caught Japan flat-footed. They had been holding back for us and were surprised by our opening to China.
Thank you very much. Jess, would you answer the next question, please?
Yes, absolutely. So this question is from Anna Graf Steiner, and she's asking about the failures, if any, that you see in Europe's relations with the policy towards China, especially in the last decade.
You say Europe's relations?
One moment, sorry. Yes, Europe's relations with and policy towards China.
Well, again, it's more accentuated under Xi, where the view on China has become much more polarized until the last couple of years, where I think just as Europe made a mistake, particularly Germany, if I may so to my host, of relying too much on the Soviets for energy. There has been a danger that the Europeans will rely too much economically on trade with China, because for most of them, this is their major trade partner outside of Europe itself. And so at times, I felt that the Europeans have been a little soft on China. That is changing because of Xi's aggressiveness, Ukraine above all, invasion, wolf warrior, this blatant propagandistic, nationalistic diplomacy, its treatment of other countries like little Lithuania, who made a small move in Taiwan and got boycotted, the fact that they pressed other countries on human rights interference and so on. Europe's views toward China have remarkably shifted. And now they are now saying in their spokesman and their security documents that China is a real problem. Now, they don't want bad relations. They don't want to have to choose completely between us and China, like most countries don't want to do that either, but they're more skeptical, and I think they're more concerned about over-reliance on China. So I wouldn't say there were huge mistakes. I do feel in the 90s and the first part of this century, Up until the last few years, I felt Europe was not quite as firm on China as we would have liked in terms of a united front.
Can I just ask you, do you think there is a different European approach to China, and not just in trade relations? Is there a kind of more structurally different approach, perhaps coming back or going back to the Second World War and the impact of war on European society? And many quoted Chancellor Scholz's visit to China as an indication of that. And also President Macron of France is going to China soon. So do we really have a divided European and American approach to China?
Much less divided, as I've indicated, than it used to be. And even then, it wasn't blatant divisions, but whether it was pressing the Chinese on trade or on human rights or concern about other actions, I think that has been changing. And I think the gap between us, which was never terribly blatant, is now further narrowed to the point that Europe's even taking an interest in Asian security, whether it's the UK submarine deal with, the UK joining us with Australia and so on. The other efforts by the French have been selling around the South China Sea. There's a resistance to the Chinese trade practices. There's some resistance and worries about security of certain investments. So I think that gap is narrowed. I personally don't have a problem with Scholz and Macron going to China. It's a little awkward now, particularly given the Chinese closeness to Ukraine, which is so important to Europe. But if they're carrying the message to the Chinese that the Russians are threatening nuclear war, that they ruin the sovereignty or try to ruin the sovereignty of a neighboring country and territorial integrity, which is supposed to be basic Chinese principles, that they've gotten close to the Russians and enabled them just as they went into Ukraine. If this message is carried forward, and if there's sufficient balance in the approach they take with the Chinese, they can deliver some useful messages. I don't think the Scholz visit was all that bad. It didn't seem to me that he undercut the US position. He made the statement that both sides, meaning the Chinese and the Germans, agreed that nuclear weapons would never be used. That's a clear slap at the Soviet Union. So I feel better about US-European collaboration on China policy than ever before. And we're careful never to tell the Europeans or the Asians that they have to blatantly choose sides and so on. But we do have an objective of aligning with them on trade, human rights, and aggression in some other areas as much as we can. And I think that's happened. So I feel pretty good about US-Europe relations on China.
Well, that's good to hear. Thank you. Willow, can we come to the next question? We can go on for a few more minutes. I know we are exhausting you, and we have many questions. We have already gone over 2 hours, but perhaps we can ask a few more questions if we may. Willow, would you go to the next one?
Well, you have to increase my compensation fee for this.
Absolutely. We'll send millions your way.
We have a couple other questions left. So Xu Zitao asks, to what extent has China's domestic politics affected the bilateral relationship in recent years? And then I would add on to that, to what extent has China's domestic politics been affected by the relationship between China and the US?
Well, it's greatly affected the relationship. Chinese foreign policy, and including relations with us, proceeds from the domestic policy. And the overriding objective has always been for Chinese leaders is the maintenance of the Communist Party in charge and stability and lack of dissent in their society. This has been greatly increased repression and surveillance under Xi. And the human rights abuses that I mentioned, including the Uyghurs in Tibet, and what's happened in Hong Kong and all the repression has greatly turned off American leaders and public. I mean, it's always been repression, but it's been so much stepped up that has increased the Americans' antagonism, not toward the Chinese people, let's make this clear, but toward the Communist Party and Xi. So that in turn, Xi is overwhelmed by his concern for security and stability. He's putting that even above economic interests by cutting off outside contacts with the world and discouraging contacts with scientists and technology experts and so on. He is, and then by injecting the state into the economy and reducing private enterprise and by taking on technology companies, all of this shows that the economy comes after political stability. So, and that he is so suspicious of the West and undermining his society that is taking precedence. So that has greatly affected his belligerent posture and what he's doing in foreign policy. And that has a circular effect in terms of American opinion of them. So yes, Chinese domestic politics are at the root of our current problems.
Thank you very much. Jess, please take the next question.
Yes, of course. This question is also from Anna Graf Steiner, and she asks, how did the opening to China and subsequent leverage on Moscow play a role in Nixon's decision to agree with Brezhnev on starting the CSCE?
Well, I think it had an indirect impact. Let's make clear that before the secret trip, which I referred to earlier, the Russians and we were having difficulty. There were so many crises, submarine base in Cuba and Soviet meddling in the Middle East. They wouldn't agree to a summit, which we wanted. As we flew to China, I got a call from Kissinger's deputy, a man named Al Haig, saying the Russians had once again turned down our invitation to a summit. We were willing to have a summit with them first. They didn't know we were going to China, of course, and they regretted it. So within weeks, the leverage we had that your question I asked about produces dramatic progress with the Soviets, the summit meeting, Berlin Agreement, SALT, and everything else. This in turn loosened up relations between the US and the Soviet Union, and in turn made initiatives like the CSCE possible. And early on, Ford and Kissinger were sort of skeptical of this, but they finally began to see that since one of the principles of the CSCE was human rights, this would be good leverage on the Soviets over time. So the leverage on the Soviets and the dramatic progress led to other agreements, some trade agreements, incidents at sea that were to be avoided, as well as the ones I mentioned. And I think it helped create the conditions for the CSCE.
Thank you very much. We have a question here from Brian Kilev, who asks about the relationship between China and North Korea, both maybe in the 1970s and 1980s and more recently. Is China really able to influence North Korea and its arms and nuclear arms policy decisively, or are the Chinese as impotent as other foreign powers regarding?
No, the Chinese could influence them. They may have been source of some restraint until recently. For example, they don't want nuclear testing, both out of principle, but also the kind of contamination across their borders. And they don't want this to get out of hand. So they have an interest in there not being a conflict, and with North Korea not becoming a major nuclear power and tempting Japan, even Taiwan and others to go the nuclear route. So they have that interest. But their greater interest is to have a friendly communist regime on their border, not have regime change or a more open society on their border threatening them. And therefore, China's been more of a problem than a help, even though it's supposedly one of their areas of cooperation between us. They have always undercut sanctions, kept the pressure off North Korea, no matter how provocative North Korea is, including in recent tests that they've stepped up. They always equivocate and have mealy-mouthed statements. So China could influence North Korea. I'm not saying it could totally change their policy, but it has tremendous influence. It's such a source of food and energy that they could really press the North Koreans to be helpful, but they don't want to destabilize the regime for the points I mentioned. And therefore, they're trying to have their cake and eat it too, keep down the nuclear arsenal of North Korea, but keep them as a friend and not put too much pressure. So they've been unhelpful. They've exacerbated the problem.
During the Nixon and the Kissinger administration, so to speak, was North Korea already an issue which was talked about in the conversations with Mao and Zhou Enlai and the others?
It was a minor issue. You have to remember that China fought with North Korea, and against us doing that. It was still a sensitive topic. And at that point, there was no nuclear issue in terms of North Korea. So they were like lips and teeth, so to speak. There was not much. We both agreed we didn't want a conflict there, but that was one of the issues where we disagreed in the Shanghai communique. We each took our allies' position. It was not a major issue, and there was certainly no areas of cooperation.
Yeah, thank you very much. Willow, would you ask the next question?
Yeah, I think we ought to begin.
Okay.
Maybe begin to bring this to a close. I'll take maybe one or two, but
okay, that's right.
Maybe I don't want to exhaust your listeners. I mean, I may not be exhausted, but they may be.
Well, we can't get enough of you and your insights and the information you provide to us. That's the reason we have been going on for so long. But you're right. Maybe we take one question from Willow, one question from Jess, and then we say goodnight. Willow, one more question.
Yeah. We have a question about communism. So throughout the 20th century, and particularly in the latter half of the 20th century, there was always a fear of Russian communism or Russian communist influence in the US with McCarthyism. Were there similar fears of Chinese communism infiltrating the United States? This is from Scott Andover.
No, I think the threat in the United States now, and I don't want to get overly political here, but it's not communism, it's, to quote a phrase, semi-fascism. And I don't think anybody espouses is any element of communist ideology. Now, there are some Chinese and Soviet efforts in cyber attacks, misinformation, trying to stir up problems among the American populace, and polarization. We know about the allegation that there was collusion between the Trump people and the Russians. So you could argue whether that's been proved, but certainly they had every interest in stirring up trouble in this country. But as an ideology, there's no problem. Now, there has been an anti-Chinese or anti-Asian element, which is dangerous, which has to be totally rejected, and has been by Biden and others. And this was not helped by comments by Trump. He talked about Kung flu when he was talking about that pandemic. And there's been too many instances of anti-Chinese and anti-Asian violence in this country, along with all the other anti-Semitism and anti-Black movements and white supremacist movements. So that is a problem. And we have to be careful as we may worry about legitimate security concerns, whether it's technology or scientists or even students, not to paint a broad brush, make it clear our problems with the communists and their agents, not with the Chinese people. I'm particularly sensitive to this issue. I'm married to a Chinese, not that we've had any problems, but I would be anyway as an American. So no, there's no danger of the ideology. There is some danger of meddling in our society. But we've got to restrict our surveillance and our security efforts to legitimate concerns and not stir up anti-Asian attitudes.
Thank you very much indeed. And now the very final question from Jess.
Yes, this question is a little more on your personal experience. So it's asking about why there weren't any Chinese Americans in your meetings. For example, like why your wife had to explain to you some of the statements that were made that were more in colloquial language.
Well, that's a fair question. Unfortunately, at the time, there were not very many Chinese Americans in the Foreign Service, the State Department, or anywhere else in the government. And to this day, there's fewer than there should be, although that's been greatly helped in recent years. But it's a fair question about, did we lack expertise on China as we opened up? Now, the fact we opened up so successfully suggests that whether or not we had sufficient expertise, we managed to pull it off. Now, when we opened up, and without outsiders knowing about what we were planning to do dramatically with the secret trip and the exchanges through the Pakistanis, it was already obvious we were trying to move in a different direction with our public statements and the trade and travel steps that we took and our rhetoric. And so Nixon and Kissinger invited Chinese experts and Chinese Americans into the White House to learn more about China. So Kissinger was more of a European expert. Nixon was more global in his expertise, but neither one pretended to be a China expert. But I think both by diligent homework, and I told about how Nixon studied all our briefing books, including Chinese culture and so on, and by inviting outside experts in, ranging from think tank experts to Chinese Americans to André Malraux, the French novelist who had written about China. They learned a great deal. And I think the fact is that they pulled it off without pretending to be China experts. They had a global strategic view. They did their homework. And this was a skill Kissinger in particular had, as I alluded earlier. He had to adjust his negotiating style to various cultures. With the Russians, they would, as I say, they would double cross you on communiques, translation. They would haggle like rug merchants. And so you had to inflate your position, ask for twice as much as you wanted so you could come down to the bottom line. With the Israelis, because of their insecurity, understandably, given their geographic position surrounded by hostile neighbors, they would look over every detail. We go to Sadat, get 8 out of 10 concessions. If the Israelis want to go back to Tel Aviv and go to Meir, would say, what happened to the other two? They were very concerned. Or the Vietnamese who used negotiations as an act of warfare to wear us down and never negotiate seriously. So Kissinger is not only dealing with the Chinese successfully, he had to deal with all these other cultures, and he was brilliant at it. And I would argue that the outcome of the China Initiative showed that even though we didn't have that many Chinese experts, although Mr. Holgage on our staff was an expert, and we drew in all the CIA and other inputs, we pulled it off pretty successfully.
Thank you very much indeed. Perhaps I have a very final question, and now you're frozen again.
Could you see me? Can you hear me?
Now you're back, yes. But perhaps I can ask you a very final question. That is, when will you publish your memoirs? We would all like to buy a copy.
Well, first, it's not my memoirs, it's more Kissinger. You mentioned my book, and it's hardly a bestseller, but maybe your audience could make it a bestseller. It came out 2 years ago. It's called Kissinger and Kissinger, as I said. But more to the point, for those genuinely interested, I have better than a memoir. I have all history for the State Department. It's easily accessible on the internet. You just go to ADST. It stands for the Association of Diplomatic Studies and Training. It's a State Department site. So it's ADST.org, O-R-G, ADST.org. And there you'll find a 1,400-page all history, the longest in the State Department. There was one, I think you had Tom Pickering on your show once.
Yes.
Tom got up to about 900 pages. So I told the State Department, if he gets any closer, let me know. I'm going to go in and dictate some more. So my point is that not just China, which is only about 20% of the memoir, everything I've done in my career is in that. And I chose to do that rather than a memoir. First place, memoirs sink without a trace, unless you're Henry Kissinger or Dean Acheson or a president. Secondly, by going into detail in the memoirs, I could take up that space, whereas in all history. But in a memoir, I'd have to do it 300 or 400 pages. And it's more useful to historians and journalists and future diplomats to see the granular detail I have in my oral history than it would be in a condensed book. So for that reason, I don't plan to write a memoir, but I think I've done my service to historians and scholars by doing this very lengthy oral history. And for those who are frightened, the first page has chapter headings, so you can pick and choose. You don't have to read 1,400 pages, but again, ADST.org.
Thank you very much. And our conversation today was probably a very nice summary of what we also can find on 1,400 pages in the State Department
Well,
archive.
only the China aspect. You don't have anything else.
That's right. That's right. There was no time. We already have used up too much of your time. If we had gone into the Vietnam negotiations, we would have even taken up more time. Ambassador Winston Law, it has been a great pleasure. Thank you very much for coming and talking to us. I hope perhaps in the future we will see you again on another topic. Who knows, another 2.5 hours. But for now, thank you very much indeed. It was indeed a great pleasure and very enlightening and informative. I would also like to thank our audience, who have stayed with us until the bitter end. And I would, of course, like to thank my two Krasno assistants, Willow and Jess, today. And I would like to mention that the Krasno Global Event Series has come to an end for this semester. But next year, in January or February, we will start up again, and we'll probably have more interesting speakers. And perhaps at some time in the future, we can ask Ambassador Winston Law to come back and talk to us again. Thank you very much for tonight, Winston Law. It was a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. I enjoyed it. Thank you so much. And to your listeners. Thank you.
Bye-bye to everyone. Good night.
Bye-bye.